Welcome to Grief Uprooted, a podcast dedicated to sharing your grief stories. Together, we embark on the mystery of one's grief journey as they learn to live, heal, and be courageous in a world rooted in trauma. Join myself, Christine, in an open discussion to help you uproot the grief in all our lives. I am an award winning author, professional speaker, and humanitarian in the field of grief and trauma. I want you to be part of the discussion. Welcome back to Grief Uprooted, a podcast dedicated to sharing your grief stories. So, my last podcast, I really shared my personal grief story from the perspective of a vulnerable 14-year-old, and I wanted to continue that story today. But what I realized was September 11th terrorist attacks that happened in 2001. Not everybody recalls that. And the next generation, I guess what I'm trying to say is I'm old. So I'm going to take a step back. As I mentioned, in the last episode, over 8,000 copies of my very first book, Where's Robert, aided the families and children that were affected by these terrorist attacks on September 11th. So, to take a step back, September 11th terrorist attacks happened in 2001. It was the morning, and it was four planes were hijacked, and each one went into a different tower. I may not have all of the facts correct in saying that. I know the trade towers and the Pentagon. It's, I guess where I'm going with this is this is very hard. I wasn't expecting my emotions to come into play so quickly, but I'm going to stick with this and I'm going to be vulnerable. So after I had delivered the 8,000 copies of Where's Robert to the World Trade Book Center, I was asked to be deployed to that book center to go to New York and work with the families. That happened on October 11th, 2001. And while everybody was leaving New York, I was heading there. And at the time, there was anthrax, I think was the other scare that was happening. And so just dealing with all these things coming at me, feeling like this was just really the very first book I ever wrote, not realizing that this was ever going to take place. This was simply a book to heal myself, to find where Robert was. So once I arrived in New York, I was then allowed to stay over at other people's homes who opened them up for people who were coming down as humanitarians to aid or who were deployed for specific reasons to help. So there was obviously a lot of firefighters and police officers and aid workers, all of us kind of combining together. And one of my specific jobs was to work in the school systems, to work in the World Trade Book Center, where people would come for resources, and I would be able to help them find those specific resources. Visiting Ground Zero, went down and with schools and others, and helping them deal with that grief in ways that they were able to outwardly show that grief. So a lot of banners, flowers, traditional ways that individuals outwardly show their grief. While I was there, I was staying at a lady's home. Her and her husband and her daughter had opened their doors to welcome myself and another humanitarian worker. And while we were there were these two bedrooms, and I stayed in one that was like Pepto-Bismol pink. That's the only pink I could describe it as. And it was filled with like Rainbow Bright, My Little Pony, Smurfs, things from the 80s. And the person that was staying in the next room, it was in baby blue. And it had He-Man, Star Wars. These two rooms really did not suit this home. And every morning, we would get up and we would jump on the subway and make our way into New York City. And one morning I had said, "Do you see the rooms we're living in?" I go, they don't match the rest of the house. The rest of the house is very modern." And looked back and yeah, I do see that. I don't know why they're like that. And I said, really, one day at dinner, I would love to uh, to ask why these rooms were like this. And we would go off to our specific stations, either working in a school or working at the World Trade Book Center. And one evening coming home, I thought, I'm just going to ask. And every night when we would all convene for dinner, they too were humanitarians and working. And they would say, you know, do you believe all this has a purpose? And I really struggled with that. I thought, here we are in a terrorist attack, in trauma. I have never really been exposed to things like this. And they're asking us for a purpose. Is this really where we're supposed to be at this moment? And the owner of the house, Elaine, beautiful woman, looks at me and says, June 21st, 1986, my only son, I was grieving. And I looked back at her and she said, my son fell off the Throgneck Bridge to his death. And she says, while you were grieving, I was grieving. And she says, I have a daughter. Her name is Christy. And she too is a redhead. And I sat pondering why this woman was telling me this story. She was much wiser than I. I was in my 20s. And I just remember feeling inside, I'm not alone. For years, I felt alone. For years, I was in that bottle that I described. I actually have the bottle here. And I put a little doll, I put Annie inside this jar. And when I'm presenting, I use this jar. And everyone thinks Annie, a lot of the younger generation, they're like, they made a doll of you? I'm like, no, she was super popular in the 80s. But that jar represents where I lived. And here I was sitting in a home with another family who was grieving alongside me. Not the same country, not the same city, but was grieving with me. She then went on to say, the blue room was my son's. The pink room is my daughter's. She never changed those rooms. She wanted to remember her children. The next morning when I got up and I entered into a local school, and every morning you would go into that kindergarten class and they would look at you and ask, is my daddy coming back today? And you would look at these little faces and you would say, I'm so sorry. Do you remember what we talked about yesterday? That there was an accident and that they have died. I truly got the quick 101 version of how to deliver a death notification. And this came from other people who had lost loved ones. There was no book, there was no manual, there was nothing on this. This was a topic no one speaks about. And one of the observations I noticed was in a grade 1 class that I often had the honor of going to pretty much every day during the week, there was this little girl in the corner, and she was using building blocks, and she built the trade towers. And she looked over and she said, "Which tower had the antenna?" And I looked back and I said, "I think it was this one." I go, "Why?" "Okay, because that's the one my dad died in." I said, "Okay." So as she built the blocks, she put her little antenna, but then she started to put red blocks. And I looked and I said, "What are the red blocks for?" And she says, "You know what? Now, when a plane comes down and it swoops down the sky, these lights are going to go on and they're going to flash so bright. They're going to be bright, 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 bright lights. And nobody will hit the trade tower again." And I sat and I thought, that's the next generation. They're figuring out solutions in grade 1. As my days went on, obviously, I had seen and experienced things I never thought I ever would in my lifetime. I sat and was honored with so many stories, and I witnessed so much heartache. And I admit that still affects me. That still causes me to feel an immense sorrow. But I knew that I was at the right place at the right time. I can go on with story over story from the month that I spent there. But soon enough, I was able to return home. And because I had volunteered, I was offered to attend Niagara University and was given a scholarship. And if you recall, I'm that dyslexic girl who was in the special learning disability class. University was not even in the scope of my life. So before I entered university, they asked me to do an educational assessment. And so I spent months with some very smart people. And I built blocks. I answered questions. They interviewed my family, actually, to learn a little more about me. This educational assessment even broadened a little bit farther. And they were trying to look at my behaviors and how I was kind of put together. It was fascinating for me. And at the end of the assessment, they came back and said, "You have figured out ways to get yourself through this educational challenge that you've been dealing with." And then they looked at me and said, "There's one thing you are superior in." And I thought, goodness me, what could it be? And he looked at me and said, "Oral communication." And I just remember thinking to myself, this man just told me I could bullshit anyone. But they did follow it up with, "You are reading people. You are basing everything on emotional reading. You know how to watch somebody. Instead of understanding the language, I'm understanding their bodies. I'm understanding their emotions, and I'm hoping to see those spirits. So I took this newfound knowledge I had into university with me, and I was enrolled in the social work department. Of course, my focus was on death and dying. And one of my projects was to study the effects of grieving on the human body. And of course, I studied myself, for after Robert had died, I was struggling with osteomyelitis, which many thought was bone cancer. So I took Dr. McIntyre's phrase, which was, if you do not talk about what's hurting you emotionally inside, it will physically kill you. I made this as my center thesis, and I would move on from there. And as I did, I started to do the research. I started to read so many other documentations about physical pain. And I started to see that living in that jar was not the healthiest thing to be doing. Emotional denial was definitely part of grief. It is definitely an element that I believe protected my brain and my spirit from fully accepting everything all at once. To me, it would be like being zapped with lightning. When we see the rain, we see it coming and we see the storm moving in. The clouds go darker, the rain starts to pick up. But imagine if that didn't happen. Imagine if you were just standing there and bam, you're hit with lightning. You'd be out. So emotional denial for me and how I understood it was a slow process. It was allowing me to process the events that were taking place at the rate that my mind, body, and spirit could. But it also became my mission to make sure no other child or human being stays in that jar too long. We need to share our grief stories. So I spent about 6 months in university and went, wow, just got all A's. But then I was approached by Lions International and Friendship Ambassadors of the United Nations, and they were colliding and creating grief camps for the families of 9/11. And when they first approached me, they said, we're looking for somebody that could run a children's grief program. We're going to bring all the families together and we're going to bring them out to camps. And the very first one we did was Triple H Hole in the Woods, which is this amazing camp where children go when they may be on the last stages of cancer or end of life care. It's an amazing old dude ranch in New York. So I agreed to volunteer for this camp. And of course, the basis of the program was Where's Robert? For it had aided and Lions were supporting the project. And it actually became an award-winning surf project for the Lions. So when I showed up, I really was looking at how I was going to go about and do this in the sense that there is nothing on grief. There is nothing on grieving and how to work with young children. And just to touch on, Kubler-Ross, an amazing woman, had actually come out with the stages of grief. And Alan Wolfelt, some amazing authors, and David Kessler. So I had this pioneers that I was reading their books fiercely, trying to understand and how to put that into action, into camp. How do I take all this amazing information from these amazing people and put it into action? So we were just coming out in the 80s with play therapy, art therapy. And there were small forms of it, people dabbling into it. But I wanted to know, how could I take this and explain this in a way that young children would understand? So the camps start, you get your cabin, and I walked into my first group of children. And I remember walking in and looking at them all and thinking, they're all staring at me. And the very first thing I noticed was they wanted to express their story. And I thought the first thing I should do is share my story. I had remembered being in high school and somebody coming up to me and asking if I wanted to go to talk to somebody. And when I sat down in front of the school counselor, they said, "Tell me about yourself." And I remember replying back, "Tell me about yourself." And they said, "We're here to talk about you." And I thought, has anybody died in your life? And they looked back and they said, "No." And then I said, "I want to know your story first." And graciously, he shared his story with me. And I remembered thinking, no, you didn't lose somebody to death, but you have felt pain. And I continued to share mine. So in this camp, I thought the very first thing I should do is read Where's Robert? Allow them to explore my story. So I sat and I started to read my book. And of course, one little child went, "You look like the girl in the book." And I said, "I'm Chrissy." And they went, "You're Chrissy?" "Yeah, I'm Chrissy, the girl in the book. Everyone calls me Christine now, but I'm that little girl." And of course, they picked up on Peanut. They're like, "Is Peanut real?" Yes, Peanut was the little chihuahua that we had. And all of a sudden, another little person said, "Can I tell you my story?" And we went around this room and each child shared their story. Obviously, our tears were flowing down our faces. They were recalling things like where they were at the time. For one child, it was bring your kids to work that day. And unfortunately, they were in an elevator in the trade towers. And they survived, but the other people didn't. And the things that that little guy struggled with was simply closing a door. We worked that week at camps, just reinforcing for him that the door needs to be closed in certain times, but it doesn't have to be locked, and nothing scary or bad is going to happen. But in his little mind, anything closing just reminded him of the most horrific day of his life. But as we worked through these stories, you saw how their minds processed, how their emotions were able to process. Yes, they're hard to hear. And I truly believe that's why we don't talk about grief. That's why we don't educate our children in school to say, hey, what happens after you have sex? We teach our children how to procreate, how to have sex, how to love, but we don't teach them how to grieve. You know, I'm asked daily, why do we grieve? And I have the answer for you. It's a simple one. The reason we grieve is because we love. We love beyond boundaries. We love unconditionally. And when we love at that level, you should be so proud of yourself. You should be so proud that you have this ability to love beyond boundaries. But when that person or that animal dies, that sorrow will be at the same depth. We grieve because we love. As the weeks progressed in these camps, I started to struggle with how to approach certain things with the kids. How do I explain fear? How do I start to explain anger, compassion, shock? All these different stages that were outlined in all these academic books that I was reading. So I grabbed a jar because everybody talked about it being like a movie. And I took that doll that I just talked about, Annie, and placed her in a jar. And I asked, how many can relate to this? And so many looked back and went, I can relate to that. It's like watching a movie. And it's like you could tell your story without emotion. But then other days you try to tell your story and you start to sob. You start to feel all these different emotions within your body. So that was the starting point of, okay, where do we go from here? How do we move on from this? So once I was able to say, let's open our jars, we slowly moved into other areas. We started to do some rope climbing. We started to swing from trees with ropes and how that fear and how that felt. And when had we ever felt that fear before in our lives? We started to look at the weather. We started to look at us within that nature. And I was very, very blessed while I was there. I had ran into an indigenous lady, and she was an elder. And I remember sitting outside the curb of a chapel there. And I would go into this chapel quite frequently and ask for strength and courage to continue doing what I'm doing. And to realize that I was placed where I should be placed. And this amazing woman came to me and she said, use your surroundings. What helped you? What healed you? And I would see her often. She would walk and I went to the chapel steps and sat there usually every morning before my program would start. And I started to talk to her about it. And I said, I feel like I have this whirlwind of emotions inside of me, and I'm not sure how to explain that or allow these children to express that. And when she looked at me and said, the weather is like life. Some days it's storming like crazy, and other days it's so calm. Some days are shiny and sunny and everything looks beautiful. And other days it's dark and dreary and miserable. And when she said that, she said, tell me about your emotions. How do you feel today? I said, I'm scared. I'm scared that I'm not going to be able to help these people. I'm vulnerable. I want to make sure that they know their story matters. And then she said, take it one step farther. I said, I'm sad. I'm angry. I'm angry that people are capable of hurting each other. But I'm also very strong. And I know that we can stand and unite and people can heal. And I would just remember that specific conversation because I went back to my group and I grabbed some construction paper, some markers, and I said to those children, we're going to make a pinwheel. And in the center of that pinwheel, you're going to put your name. And on each point of the pinwheel, I want you to label an emotion you're feeling. Anger was very strong. Sadness, fear, shock, numbness, loneliness. There is no right or wrong when it comes to our feelings. None. It is what you feel, and that is right for you at that moment. But we also want to say, in those feelings, there must be courage. It takes courage to live life. It's not easy some days. We need to laugh again. We need to feel joy, security, safety, happiness. Tell me those moments that existed that may come again. So as the children worked fiercely on creating these pinwheels, they started to add color. So for anger, they wanted to put red. Sometimes they put dark colors. Then we had some people felt joy when they remembered the memories of their parents or their siblings or their grandparents or just friends that had passed in 9/11. We also have to remember this was all over the media. So even if children hadn't lost somebody in the terrorist attacks, we were all being exposed to it. So as they created a way, I held up my pinwheel and I said, now, this pinwheel is you. And all these emotions are felt by all of us. And some days, the weather is insane and the pinwheel is spinning, and you feel utterly crazy. I'm telling you, you feel crazy. One minute you're happy, the next minute you're sad. You feel happiness, you then feel guilty for feeling happiness because you shouldn't feel happy because your loved one is dead. But then you feel guilty for that simple happiness you're feeling. It is a crazy land of emotions, and there is no right or wrong. We should not feel guilty for feeling happy, but we do. We're all different, and all journeys are different, and no grief story is right or wrong. But as I did this, I spun the pinwheel. And then there's a day where it just stops. There's no wind, there's no rain. And you may feel peace. You may feel happiness. You may feel angry. You may just feel one emotion on that day. We then toted all these pinwheels outside to a garden and we plopped them in the ground and we left them there for the whole camp. I loved watching the children go outside in the mornings and in the evenings and go, my pinwheel is spinning. Other days, my pinwheel is not even moving. And this gave us the ability to take our grief and really give it a visual. That one activity I started to document. And you know where this is headed. It's headed right into my next book, Hugs, Helping Understand Grief Sessions. And as the camps went on, because we did them many times over and over again, I continuously added these activities. And I went back to talk to that Indigenous lady so many times. It felt like just a blessing to learn about her culture, to have her guidance in a way that helped my spirit to grow and heal even farther. This particular camp, when it came to a close, the pinwheels were all taken out of the ground and each child brought them home. And I received pictures of them in their backyards and their front gardens. because they became a symbol of hope, a symbol of, yes, it's okay to feel all these emotions at once, and it's okay to not feel emotions at once. It's okay to feel one emotion. We were able to take our grief and give it that visual. I was often asked to go into Canadian schools and talk about the news and the media. And this was because it was bombarding our children. And obviously, families all had difference of opinions when it came to these type of things. And children had witnessed so much on the news and in school and were told so many different things. And I went into a grade 1 class here in Ontario, Canada. And while I was in there describing what it was like to be at ground zero, to deliver the books that a lot of these children had written, letters that were placed in the boxes of Where's Robert, I looked over in the corner and there was this little boy. And he was taking these building blocks and he was building a tower. And as he started to put the blocks one by one on top of each other, my mind went back to that little girl that was in grade 1 who had asked me which tower had the antenna on it. And as I watched this little guy, I approached him and I said, "What are you building?" He said, "I'm building the trade towers." And all of a sudden, he takes out 4 yellow blocks. And one by one, he places the yellow blocks on top. And I look back at him and I say, "What is the yellow blocks for?" He goes, "Oh, those are bright, bright yellow lights with sirens." And he goes, "When the planes come down, they're going to see these lights. They're going to hear this noise and they're going to turn. They're not going to hit into the trade towers." And he gestures with his hand how a plane is going to come down and miss. And as I looked at him and said, "That's a very good idea. And I think that would be a great addition when and if they rebuild these towers." I had realized at that very moment, grief has no boundaries. It is the one thing in life that is non-discriminating. 2 children in 2 different countries, both grieving on different levels, different ways, but both children coming up with a solution to make our world a better place. Just as I was sitting at that table in that home, realizing I'm grieving the same time other people in this world are grieving, these 2 children have these tiny little minds that are just churning on ways to make sure this terrorist attack does not occur again. Of course, it's the innocence of their minds. But it was just such a miraculous experience to realize that the next generation is looking at ways to help us make it through, to help us move forward. Your grief story matters. It matters not only to you, but to the rest of the world. I want to encourage you to join me and sharing your grief story. I want to encourage all of you to write books. We need to start sharing. We need to start talking about death and dying and grieving. And we need to realize it comes in all forms. It is not just the death of a loved one. It's divorce, it's suicide, it's addiction, anticipatory grief. There's so much. And at the root of most of our lives is this grief that spawns out to so many other issues and things that we are trying to overcome and try to move forward. We're going to uproot our grief and we're going to heal. Yes, in a world that is rooted in trauma on so many different levels. But we're going to open that up today. We're going to open it up in this podcast, and I ask you to join me. Let's uproot the grief together. Let's share our stories, and let's help our next generation come up with some solutions. Until next time, take care and know that your story matters to the world.